Hi, this is Chapter 1, How Do We Learn? So, learning about learning itself sounds pretty confusing, but learning is more than just watching videos such as this and taking notes. We actually learn continuously throughout our lives, and every day new information enters our brains, is processed, and stored in a way that allows it to be found again and used. We have storerooms in our brains that hold memories of all the people we've known, all the experiences we've had, the emotions we've felt, facts we've learned, and skills we've mastered, as well as any vocabulary or languages that we know. However, as we all know, the storeroom isn't perfect, and items often get lost or exchanged for others when we didn't intend to. So when we actually retain information into our brain in a way that we can actually recall and use later, we can say that it has been learned. Learning is very closely related to another concept called memory. Once we actually learn something, we can recall it from memory or remember it. So, learning is essentially the process of acquiring information or skills, while memory is more about the recall of knowledge that's already stored or skills that are already stored in your brain. Sometimes we actually make a conscious effort to learn something. For example, when we learn a new instrument, such as the guitar. Or at other times, we actually learn things without any effort. For example,
Nationwide is on your side.
did that jingle sound familiar? I'm sure most of you guys immediately recognized it without really ever consciously attempting to learn or memorize it. So learning isn't just limited to humans either. Even very simple animals are actually more than capable of learning things in different ways. Even plants, for instance, can actually adjust their response to light by growing towards the sun. And even this is a form of learning. So in higher animals like humans, a lot of learning actually involves forming associations. Association is essentially learning by making connections between sensations, ideas, memories, and even responses. Just as an example, if your cat or dog gives you their paw every time you get out a treat, that's an example of association. Your dog has essentially associated being fed with raising their paw. Here's an example of that. Paw? Good boy. Imitation is another important concept in many types of learning, and you can see it everywhere, such as learning to tie a shoelace by watching someone, or even just emulating the action of shooting a basketball, because no one necessarily teaches us these things. We just learn by observing someone else. Repetition is another important element of learning. We say things like phone numbers over and over to ourselves to help us remember them. And even as children, we practice walking by falling over and over again until we're able to do it. And this is a form of repetition.
So now that we've gotten our introduction into how we learn, we're going to talk about 3 different ways. 3 are habituation, classical conditioning, and instinct. First, habituation. Imagine I screamed into the camera. What would your reaction be? You'd probably be startled. Now imagine if I screamed into the camera 10 straight times. By the 10th time, you probably wouldn't be as scared because you'd have gotten used to it. This is an example of habituation. It's when we get used to certain stimuli. Stimuli are just things that provoke a response. The process of habituation is known as adaptation, and an increase in response to certain stimuli is known as sensitization. What really happens when you get used to something is that your neurons are starting to send fewer signals to your brain when you consistently receive the same stimulus, and as a result, there's not as high of a response. The next type of learning we're going to talk about is classical conditioning. This is learning by association. This type of learning was studied by Pavlov in his famous experiment with his dogs. Basically what he did was every time he fed his dogs, he would ring a bell. Slowly, the dogs began to associate the sound of the bell with the food. So later on, after a while, when Pavlov would ring the bell, the dogs would begin to salivate because they expected to be fed. There was no food present, but they would still salivate because they associated the sound of the bell and the food. They had been conditioned to react to the bell in the same way that they react to food. And finally, we're going to talk about instinct. Instinct are things that we know without necessarily being taught. These are essentially already hardwired into our brains. Things such as a baby knowing to smile at its mother or a bird building its nest are things that we don't need to be taught, and they're things that we simply do to survive.
So now that we talked about learning, let's put it to the test. Here we have a poem called Memories. It goes like this. Your memory is like a backpack where you keep all your notes, all the ones you want to keep and even those you don't. It takes them and files them in pockets made for you. They all have special places, some for longer, it is true. There's a place for short-term memories of what just happened today, but lots of long-term space as well for things that need to stay. So, can you recall everything I just said? Chances are probably not, but what we just learned before is that if we associate this poem with images, then we can have a better chance of remembering the poem, because that is one way of how we learn things. Let me read the poem again, with images this time. Your memory is like a backpack, where you keep all your notes, all the ones you want to keep, and even those you don't. It takes them and files them in pockets made for you. They all have special places, some for longer, it is true. There's a place for short-term memories of what just happened today, but lots of long-term space as well for things that need to stay. Now, you're probably thinking that you still can't remember every line of the poem, but that's okay. It takes time to remember something completely after learning it. However, you should be able to recall a few words from the poem, especially after looking at the images, like backpack, for example. This works by association, which if you remember learning, is when we link one idea to another. In this case, an image to a word. So hopefully after this video, you learned some of the ways of how we learn things, such as imitation, repetition, and of course, association. In essence, remembering what you learn takes time, and in this case, practice makes perfect. So remember to practice.